up until the Heppner Flood. The thunderstorm came on all of a sudden toward the end of a hot, sun-baked Sunday afternoon. It was about 4:30, maybe 4:45, when black clouds seized the sky over the Blue Mountains of eastern Oregon and erupted in a torrent of rain and hail. Even in an arid region where rainstorms go by the names cloudbursts and waterspouts, this was heavy rain. One woman said it was like a tub of water pouring over her throughout the storm. And the hail was not the ordinary kind formed by layers of ice. These chestnut-sized chunks were clear ice, created at least 9 miles straight up from Morrow County. Never mind if the thermometers in Heppner read 94 degrees. At more than 50,000 feet, it could have been well below zero. Everyone here wanted rain. Agriculture was the engine of Heppner's success, and everyone knew that wheat and a bountiful supply of grass and hay for livestock were essential. Day after cloudless day, June had been abnormally dry. Some heavy rain Thursday brought temporary hope, but everybody recognized it wasn't enough to save the harvest and went back to wishing and praying for more. If rain came by thunderstorm, people here were accustomed to thunder and lightning on hot afternoons in spring and early summer. It's partly the topography. Hundreds of bluffs, buttes, prairies, hills, benches, ridges, gullies, and canyons contour the landscape between the highest of the Blue Mountains and downtown Heppner. These terrain discontinuities can concentrate the convection that sets off thunderstorms when heated air rises and collides with cooler air aloft. Regrettably, this storm broke directly over the headwaters of Balm Fork, about 8 to 10 miles south of Heppner, and also dumped tons and tons of rainwater into Willow Creek and another of its tributaries, Hinton Creek. The water raced into canyons it had been carving for centuries, and there wasn't much to stop it. The east slopes of the hills were mostly bare rock, and there wasn't much in the way of soil or roots to catch the water on the west slope either. Wind, earlier cloudbursts, and hungry livestock had already been there. What made it worse was that the Thursday downpour had moistened what soil there was, cutting down on how much it could absorb on Sunday. The U.S. Geological Survey would call it one of those very heavy storms of short duration covering a very small area, so peculiar to the arid region. Such a storm is almost like a tornado in its suddenness, destructibility, and limited extent. 7-year-old Lena Hughes, who was 12 miles south of Heppner with their parents, Matthew and Angeline, remembered a broad black streak almost straight north of us, which seemed to be coming straight down from the sky. That could have been a tornado. Severe thunderstorms produce tornadoes, and in eastern Oregon, tornadoes have a tendency to occur on or about June 14th. The total rainfall, the USGS said afterward, was 1.5 inches over 20 square miles. But to the agency's engineer, John Whistler, the amount of rain wasn't the main thing. Writing a month later, he noted that the great destructiveness of these so-called cloudbursts is due more to the rugged character of the topography and the almost utter absence of vegetation. Jenny Curran and her 2 youngest were a mile south of Heppner on the farm they had bought in March from James and Delitha Jones. Jenny and the girls had started supper, but when the storm came on so strong, they let the kitchen fire go out. My, what a roar! Rain and hail beat on our east porch till water ran in under the door and a stream across the dining room and kitchen floor. She called it a river in the lane, the cowshed, and the barn, 6 inches deep in our yard. The storm got to Heppner about 5 p.m. and sent just about everyone inside. It was nearly supper time anyway, and people getting a meal ready or sitting down to eat must have been relieved to close their windows and doors against the commotion. The rain and hail pounded in endless staccato while lightning bolts chased each other across the thick black sky, and the thunder rumbled louder than a locomotive. N.L. Tucker, a civil engineer and salesman for Fairbanks Morris & Company, had a room in Heppner's Palace Hotel. I went to my room on the second floor to take a nap. I was brought suddenly wide awake by a frightful clap of thunder. Going to the window, which faced up Willow Creek toward the hills, I saw a great mass of the blackest clouds huddling over the mountaintops. From that time on, the roll of thunder was incessant and deafening. I was through the terrible St. Louis cyclone of 1897, and the looks of the storm clouds surrounding Heppner very much reminded me of the atmospheric conditions preceding the other horror. While the storm bombarded Heppner from the sky, the water it had already dumped on the mountains and foothills was mobilizing south of town. Every minute, more water squeezed between canyon walls. Every minute, the nascent, muddy rivers collected more debris. When Oregonian reporter A. Crofton later traced the flood to its source, he reported hills deeply scored by thousands of small watercourses made by Sunday's storm. In most of these, the current must have been strong enough to sweep the stoutest man off his feet. At the base of each little gully are stones and boulders piled from 3 to 10 feet deep. As there is practically no vegetation on that eastern hillside, the water had as free a course as on a shingled roof, and the watercourses are cut like ditches, nearly straight. The water roared north, 90% of it down the channel of Balm Fork. The wave had been carrying boulders and trees. Now it added evidence of human presence: fence posts, chickens, wagon wheels, rakes, frying pans, bridles, books. Soon it was a wall of water advancing in pulses, first backing up with its growing burden of debris against farm buildings and fences made of wood or woven wire, then smashing through. Just before reaching Heppner, the wave raging along Balm Fork slammed into Willow Creek. Balm is a tributary of Willow, but this time the merging was furious. The flood riding the Balm Channel crashed clear across swollen Willow Creek, gouging a cove in the far bank that locals pointed out for 80 years. Balm Fork and Willow were now Willow Creek, or rather Willow Creek possessed by a flash flood. When this wall of churning gray-brown water boiled out from between the hills hugging Willow, it was as high as the tallest barn in the county. From his room in the palace, salesman Tooker saw what appeared to be a great pyramid of rolling dirty wool. Projecting from this at every conceivable angle, writhing, twisting, and tumbling, but ever moving onward with the speed of an express train, were trees, houses, great rocks, and tons of earth. The wall of water was fully 30 feet in height, and as far as I could see behind it, a sea of turbulent brown-black liquid stretched. It was June 14th, 1903. On this day, Heppner's buildings spread along the flat on both banks of Willow Creek and more sparsely on up the slopes that cradled the Willow Creek Valley. The town was just over 1 mile long. Willow Creek entered Heppner at the south city limits and meandered north through town until it merged with Hinton Creek and turned west a few blocks shy of the north city limits. As it left Heppner, the creek wound into the northerly path it followed some 40 miles to the Columbia River. 3 years before June 1903, the 1900 census had counted 1,146 citizens. In 1903, about 1,290 people lived in town. Since it was the weekend, maybe 50 others had joined them, men in from their jobs on ranches and farms, and out-of-town guests staying with friends or at the hotels and rooming houses. Homes in Heppner lined up as close as they could to Willow Creek. Families needed the water. Every house had a garden, and just about everyone had a cow, at least one horse, and some chickens. Living on Willow Creek was pleasant most of the year, when the creek babbled along between 1 and 4 feet deep. From July to September, Willow was usually only an occasional puddle, but even so, the cottonwoods and balm poplars on its banks offered welcome shade. Heppner's most prosperous families lived in beautiful big houses. Many of the homes nearby were cottages, probably the homes of seamstresses, carpenters, clerks, the stage driver, liverymen, butchers, the baker, and day laborers. The Chinese men who moved to Heppner after building the railroads or mining gold lived in tiny houses at the edge of Willow Creek. They were saving their money to return to China. Though homes and businesses were mingled through town, Heppner's primary business district ran roughly parallel to Willow Creek, a block and a half west. The aroma, especially on Main, announced that Eastern Oregon still depended on horses for muscle and transportation. On that 5-block street alone, there were 4 blacksmiths and 3 livery stables. Samuel McBride built wagons on Main, and a person could buy a handmade saddle or harness or hay there. The streets were plain dirt, which meant a fog of dust in summer and a loblolly of mud in winter. Main Street was 100 feet wide because thousands of sheep and herds of cattle filled the street from side to side when they were driven north through town, in the early days all the way to the Columbia River, and after 1888 to the train station at the north edge of town. Especially during the summer, horses and mules constantly pulled strings of pack wagons through the streets, bringing in goods and collecting supplies for distant ranches and work crews. Main Street was anchored at its south end by buildings made of brick and stone. The handsome 3-story Palace Hotel was bragging material on the northeast corner of Main and May. The palace had a stone foundation, and its exterior was of brick made by John Jenkins in his brickyard on Hinton Creek, northeast of town. The hotel entrance, up 5 steps from the street, mirrored the diagonal entry of the First National Bank of Heppner directly across Main. The First National building of brick and limestone had been a dignified presence for 18 years. Adjoining the bank, a row of 7 storefronts sold groceries and drugs, hardware and wallpaper, furniture, baths, shaves, and haircuts. All were encased in stone or brick, and there was not an inch of space between them. Another half-block north, at Main and Willow, was the Roberts Building, completed in 1901, a structure of native blue basaltic rock from the Osman Ranch up Balm Fork. The first floor housed a saloon known as The Rock, and though the upstairs was designed to provide for an opera house and dance hall, it would also serve a more vital purpose. Next door to the north, the 5-month-old home of Willow Lodge No. 66, International Order of Oddfellows, was built of the same stone. The Fair Building, a squat rectangle clad in sun-dried brick, was another block north at Main and Center. The Fair was a mercantile operation and the place to save money. It covered 8,000 square feet at ground level, and 3 or 4 apartments filled the top floor. Nearly all the other businesses on Main, a confectionery, lumber yards, farm implement dealers, druggists, milliners, a bicycle shop, the Heppner Opera House, and several restaurants, were built of wood, which was plentiful in the mountains south of town. Heppner's businesses supported agriculture and vice versa. The most common occupation in Morrow County was raising livestock, principally sheep. Farming, growing crops, mainly wheat, came next. Farm laborers, cowboys, and sheep tenders lived permanently in the county, but much of the work was seasonal, so many men traveled from job to job, their residence dictated by the cycles of ranching and farming. Cowboys, ranch hands, and farm workers came into Heppner on weekends for rest and recreation, reconnecting with friends and to get supplies. They also got baths, haircuts, and shaves at barbering establishments, and had their dusty clothes cleaned at the Chinese men's wash houses or at Fred Krug's Heppner Steam Laundry. Men with no homes in town spent much of their time in the 5 saloons or the Palace Hotel, which offered a bar as well as cards and billiards. At McCaddy and Swaggart's, a peerless electric self-playing piano played music from the most celebrated artists of the world to the most commonplace ragtime. Edward C. Ashbaugh served no liquor at his pastime billiard parlors. Instead, his January 1st, 1903 Gazette ad boasted he offered hot Vigorol and soft drinks, clam tea, hot and cold soda, ciders, etc. When the subject of Heppner's saloons came up, someone would quickly mention that Heppner also had 6 churches. Baptist, Methodist Episcopal, Methodist Episcopal South, Episcopal, Roman Catholic, and Christian. A Roman Catholic priest came to Heppner once a month. On his June 14th visit, Reverend John Walsh said Mass for his flock in the parish church up the Chase Street Hill. A priest also rode a horse and buggy from ranch to ranch in the county outside Heppner, ministering to many of the Irish immigrants who had been a growing presence in Morrow County for a decade. The men of the cloth may have found occasion to speak to their flocks about the Chateau de Joie, but Molly Reed, the 37-year-old madam, paid her Morrow County property taxes, and her 5 employees didn't hide their occupations from the census taker. They worked in a 2-story building on Willow, just behind the Roberts Building and its Rock Saloon. Like many others, these women would assume a different role on Monday. An imposing leather-bound history of Morrow County and the adjoining Umatilla County came out in 1902, declaring that the warfare between culture and coarseness, between morality and license, refinement and debasement is to be seen in every town, but nowhere more typically so than in the frontier town of Heppner. Here are men of a sincere and enlightened piety, and here also are men who acknowledge no obligations except to keep safely within the requirements of the law or to escape detection if they occasionally do violence to its letter. Between the two extremes is the great middle class, by far the most numerous. There is a pleasing sense of equality. Morrow County was almost entirely white. Among the 4,151 residents counted in 1900, only 21, all men, were not Caucasian. The census said 12 were born in China, 2 in Mexico, and the others in Japan. Yet this isolated county had attracted immigrants from around the world. 77 said they'd been born in Ireland, 51 in Sweden, 45 in Germany, 31 in England, 16 in Russia, 11 in Scotland. Heppner was known for its wealth. On New Year's Day, 1902, the Gazette reported that the people of Morrow County are prosperous. There are a great many well-to-do people. The supplement's business directory indeed listed 3 jewelry stores. 3 grocery stores and 3 drugstores also served Heppner, and counting mail-order catalogs and other merchants, it seemed possible to acquire just about anything. Large sacks and crates of staples were available for families who came to town to stock up once or twice a year. Whether customers bought sugar, flour, and coffee, or crochet hooks, overalls, and lye soap, merchants kept a running tab. They expected the accounts to be paid off once a year, when the livestock and wool were auctioned or the wheat harvested and sold. Though coal lamps were still widely used, more and more homes and businesses had electric lights. Heppner had a library, a telephone operator with a switchboard, and 2 weekly newspapers. In 1903, men were expected to provide for their families and routinely took side jobs and temporary work to supplement their incomes. Only a few women had businesses, millinery, dressmaking, restaurants, boarding houses, or professions, teaching being the main one. But if a woman sold some eggs or milk or butter, it was a welcome contribution to the family's resources. When it could be spared, it was her spending money. If children were old enough to work out for other families, their wages too commonly went in the same jar. Most women did their own sewing, and many spun the thread and wove the cloth first. In 1903, it would be another 9 years and 4 elections before Oregon women could vote. Even though parents buried a heartbreaking number of infants then, large families were the norm. In 1900, Morrow County census said 54% of the population were adults and almost 46% were not yet 21. True, it took many hands to get the work done, but there was another reason for having a large family, one Nina Cox Harshman articulated in 2005. I don't think they knew how not to. A town about to have a deadly flood was lucky to earn the label a lodge town. Adults in Heppner generally belonged to at least one lodge. With their secret rituals and formal meeting rooms, lodges had one thing in common. The members took care of each other. In 1903, Heppner had at least 12 fraternal orders for men and 4 sister lodges for women. The 1898 minutes of the Heppner Masonic Lodge, number 69 AF and AM, offer a look into the members' commitment. A committee was appointed to look up the widows of deceased Masons and see if they wanted for anything. Moreover, along with providing a sense of belonging and mutual support, most lodges offered their members life insurance. The Masonic Lodge owned the cemetery and donated the grave sites for victims of the Heppner Flood. Dealing with a disaster would be easier because people in Morrow County knew that when the greater good required it, everyone answered the call. In 1873, for example, the newly incorporated town needed a school. Henry Heppner, the childless bachelor and entrepreneur for whom the town had just been named, ostentatiously put up $100 worth of materials, got on a horse, and rode around soliciting subscriptions. The collection came up short, but another well-to-do bachelor, Nelson Jones, made up the difference. In 1887, ranchers and businessmen wanted a faster way to receive goods and move livestock and wool to market. They dug into their pockets and purchased the right-of-way along Willow Creek and enough land for a railroad depot. That convinced the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company to build its branch line south to Heppner. 2 other values were going to become evident as well: mutual trust and self-reliance. As local author W. W. Weatherford put it, there was considerable oral contracting in business, and a man's word was as good as his bond or note. Eastern Oregon storekeepers left their brooms, apples, potatoes, and such out on the sidewalk 24 hours a day. But first came independence. You had a pretty good start on self-reliance before you started in the first grade, or you couldn't make it. Time you were 6 and ready for school, you had to be able to ride a horse good enough to get there and back, and that could be several miles each way. An ordinary Sunday. This day that the people of Heppner would remember for the rest of their lives began in an utterly forgettable way. June 14th was a typical Sunday. People went to church in the morning. They had dinner, some of them a picnic. The men in town from ranching and farming jobs probably got up late after last night and met their friends again in the afternoon at Heppner's watering establishments. Some families went to church a second time late in the afternoon. Sunday was the only sanctioned day of rest. Women would prepare supper for 5:30 or 6, but otherwise, after church, the pace was more leisurely, with time for socializing, for children playing outside, for reading the Saturday Evening Post. Properly dressed men were wearing 3-piece suits all day, as they did on the Lord's Day every week. Women wore long, full skirts for every occasion, including gardening, milking, and attending church. They were wearing them on June 14th, and the women who survived the Heppner Flood would wear them the day after. On Saturday, after their shift at the Heppner post office, Gertrude Crawford and Anna McBride had walked to the Crawford house on the west hillside. Anna stayed an hour or so. Gertrude was 23, Anna a year younger. They had worked together 2.5 years. The friends always spent Sunday, their day off, together. But this Sunday they did not. As the days had been quite warm, we decided we would both stay at home out of the sun. Gertrude and her mother remained inside Sunday, partly because Elizabeth Crawford did not feel well. Across town, Anna spent the day with her parents and 3 of her siblings in the McBride home east of Willow Creek. William and Eliza Barrett and their children lived in town during the school term and on the ranch at Sand Hollow every summer. It was customary for any family of farmers or ranchers who could afford a town home to acquire one as soon as the children reached school age. Early the afternoon of June 14th, the Barretts finished packing up their house on Willow Creek, probably said goodbye to their neighbors, perhaps including the McBrides a block north, and with their 3 children drove the wagon to the ranch. About 4 blocks northwest of the McBrides, Sarah Sailing Morgan, a widow and mother of 10, had driven her family's wagon into town from their cattle ranch east of Heppner. She came in to meet and no doubt get her hands on her new grandchild. Sarah's son Robert, his wife Pearl, and their baby lived across Chase Street from Pearl's parents, Abe and Betty Wells. Thomas W. Ayers was at home on Willow Creek Sunday afternoon with his daughter, Mary Elizabeth Kirk, who only days before had moved back to Heppner with her children following the death of her husband, William. Mary had unloaded their belongings into the Ayers house on the other side of the creek. Tom's brother, William, was also visiting from his house 2 doors away. More than 40 years earlier, the 2 men had brought their families to Oregon from Iowa in an 1862 wagon train. While William and his family kept going to the Dalles and the Willamette Valley, Tom and his family settled near Butter Creek, northeast of Heppner. Tom was what they called a self-made man. While farming near Butter Creek, he also delivered supplies, including produce from his garden, by pack train to the Columbia River and to mines along the Grand Ronde. He raised livestock and, before moving his family into town in 1878, owned 1,180 head of cattle, 3,025 horses, and 1 mule that he famously and repeatedly refused $300 for because the animal had been so loyal. The 1903 Morrow County jury pool listed Tom as a capitalist. One reason he had funds to loan was this. 9 years after George Stansbury started Stansbury Flat in 1869, Tom Ayers bought all the lots Stansbury had left, which is to say most of the original town site of Heppner. Tom sold the Stansbury properties one by one, but he kept the site of the Stansbury cabin on Willow Creek for the home he and Eliza shared, and that was where he and the others were spending June 14th. He also kept several adjoining lots for his extended family. When the wooden courthouse was torn down in favor of the handsome stone building that opened 3 months before the flood, Tom Ayers bought the old structure's materials. Sunday afternoon, when the storm turned threatening, Tom, who was part owner of Heppner Water and Electric Company, would have run over to the electric plant to check on things, but he was back home before 5:20. Sunday afternoon, Sadie McCarty was walking to an appointment in the photo studio of Bert Sigsbee, the portrait photographer who would take over Mike Galloway's business the next day. Sadie was living with Robert and Izoria, or Zoe, Hind in North Heppner while learning the dressmaking trade, and she brought along the Hinds' 3-year-old daughter, Jean Lucille. Walking south on Main Street, they ran into Robert Hind. Because of the heat, he decided to take Jean Lucille back home. Alexander Marcus Gunn, a 50-year-old farmer and blacksmith, was at home with his wife Elizabeth, 45, and 2 of their 4 children in the house Marcus built last year at the corner of Main and Church Streets, across from the Heppner Hotel. 7-year-old Gertrude was at the M.E. Church South, practicing for the children's program, and Isabella, 12, was visiting a family just outside town. Young Marcus and Mary were home, and they had a visitor. Hazel Carr, a friend of 14-year-old Mary, had come by earlier with her youngest sister, Lilius. Hazel then went on to another friend's house, and while she was away, 15-month-old Lilius was staying with the Gunns. Friends and family gathered in the spacious home of Gilbert and Cora Phelps at the corner of Water Street and Gale, a stone's throw from where Willow Creek and Hinton Creek converge in North Heppner. Cora had served ice cream to their guests, among them Blanche Redfield, daughter of Heppner lawyer C.E. Redfield, and Cora's brother Fred Hart, who worked at the railway station. As a rainstorm swept into town, they went out on the covered porch to watch. But then the skies filled with frightening thunder and lightning. Fred bid them goodbye and hurried to the station. Blanche said her thank yous and ran as fast as her 12-year-old legs could take her the 2 blocks to her mother, Belle. Soon, the rain became so heavy they had to go inside. When Hinton Creek was out of its banks and flowing over the ground, Bert, a lawyer and Morrow County state representative, pulled on his boots and raincoat and announced he was going to see how bad it was. Heppner Mayor Frank Gillum and his wife Effie were in Portland. The mayor might have been on business for the big hardware and implement store he and Lou Bisbee owned in Heppner. Tim Bisbee had died last September 2nd. Lou Bisbee succeeded his father. Since Frank was an active Mason, the timing was no doubt dictated by a Masonic Grand Lodge gathering in Portland. Just 10 days earlier, Frank had unloaded 62,000 pounds of freight, farm implements, sewing machines, and such, into Gillum and Bisbee's 2 warehouses. At least 5 other Heppner men were in Portland that weekend. George Curran went down earlier to see family in Curransville before the start of Grand Lodge. Morrow County Commissioner Edward Ashbaugh was there on county business. The others were Robert Beard, Columbus A. Ray, and Charles E. Redfield. James and Delitha Jones were renting a small house that belonged to James W. Cowens just inside the South City limits. This had been a big change. The Joneses had lived about a mile south of there for 30 years, raising cattle and horses, fruit and berries, operating a dairy, and delivering milk in town. James and Delitha, both 65, moved to this rental in March after selling their home place to George and Jeannie Curran. The Joneses were, at most, days from moving to Okanagan, Washington, where James and the Jones sons had already trailed the livestock. James came back to get the rest of the family and found Delitha was sick. Waiting for her to be well enough to leave, James and Delitha spent this stormy afternoon with 2 daughters, Elsa Jones, 26, and Amanda Kimsey, 44, and their 3-year-old granddaughter, Elizabeth Kimsey. At the other end of town, the Heppner Hotel was doing a respectable business. The 2-story structure had a balcony with a decorative railing running the length of the 2nd floor and a dining room on the ground floor. It had been operating on North Main for 23 years, maybe more. It was known first as the City Hotel. Only a little more than 10 years earlier, the hotel had undergone a substantial remodel. To be sure, it is a frame building, but from cellar to garret and office to kitchen, every part has received that attention necessary to render it what one would expect in a first-class hotel. 25 people were guests in the hotel on Sunday, including 2 couples. The Charles Boyers from Garnett, Kansas, checked in that day. The Pat Bergs were longer-term residents. The rest of the guests seemed to be men traveling on their own. John Stein had been staying there for about 3 months while arranging to buy or maybe start a bank. His family was in Portland waiting for moving day. W.A. Fisher, owner of a fine orchard about 100 miles southwest of Heppner, near Haystack, had been at the hotel several weeks while undergoing treatment for some internal complaint. J.P. Tharp, a surepeter from Virginia, was registered at the hotel, as was Otis Bullis, a 23-year-old man on a cattle drive whose hometown isn't known. Fred L. Huggins of Blair, Nebraska, was on the guest register. So was Albert Turner, a sheep shearer from Charlton, Iowa. Moses and Mary Ashbaugh and L. Pearl and May Jones had been leasing the hotel together since February. The Ashbaugh and Jones families both raised wheat at 8 Mile, west of Heppner, after emigrating separately from Iowa. May and Moses were siblings, and so were their spouses, Pearl and Mary. A month before they took over the hotel, Moses Ashbaugh and Pearl Jones had opened a short order cafe in Heppner. On June 14, 1903, Mary Jones Ashbaugh was 31 years old. She was nearly blind, but did nearly everything that a person with good vision could do. All her own housework, baking, mending, etc., her daughter Neva wrote years later. Mary had not been able to see much since she came down with measles when she was 4 years old and developed a bad case of pink eye. That was in Iowa about 2 years before she came with her parents and brothers to Morrow County in 1882. Mary and Moses would have their 6th wedding anniversary less than 2 weeks after June 14th. Their Floyd was 4 years old, but Kenneth was still tiny at just 6 weeks. Pearl and May Jones had been married 10 years. They had 5 children: Vance, 9, Amy, 8, Leiter, 6, Zelma, 3, and Everett, 14 months. Like others who died on June 14th or survived, Pearl and May and Moses and Mary had made hundreds of apparently trivial choices that led them one unremarkable step and one choice at a time into or away from the path of a flash flood. The Ashbaughs and the Joneses traded off working Sundays at the hotel. That day it was Pearl and May's turn to be the proprietors on duty. Moses and Mary were off June 14th, inside the cottage out back. June 14th, 5:20 p.m. It is reported that a tremendous cloudburst occurred at Heppner late in the afternoon. All communication with that town has been cut off and nothing definite can be learned. Forecast official Beals had no reports of any cloudburst, but they would not reach me today in any case. That's from an article, Heppner is Cut Off, from the Portland Oregonian, June 15th, 1903. Harry and Emma Hanby were busy in their tiny house in a canyon just off Balm Fork, 5 miles south of Heppner. They had, or maybe were in the middle of delivering, a new baby. Harry's mother, Melissa Hanby Kirk, was there to help. 22-year-old Nora Florian, house-sitting at a family ranch nearby, may have been lending a hand inside, or she might have been out going for the doctor. Eudora Hart and her husband Ransom and their eldest son Bob were inside their ranch house on Balm. Eudora was in the kitchen. She had baked a pie for Sunday supper and placed it on the lower shelf of the cupboard to cool. They had expected the creek near their house to rise, but it rained so hard they did not see it. Bob stepped out the front door to look again at the exact moment the wave hit the house. The Hanby family and Nora Florian were the first victims of the Heppner Flood. Eudora Hart was next. She died when the kitchen was ripped from the rest of their home. When the floodwaters entered Heppner a few minutes later, Lee Cantwell, who had a bicycle shop in town, was watching from the hill. He reported that when the wave on Balm Fork crashed into Willow, it slowed momentarily until it piled up 30 feet high. It then gained greater speed until it slowed against the little house James and Delitha Jones were renting. Further on, several houses hung it up again until a huge volume of water in the rear caught up, and it plunged forward with renewed and greater force than ever. All 5 in the Jones family died. The Heppner flood had now killed 11 people. In the next hour and roughly 12 minutes, it would claim another 227 victims, obliterate their homes, and leave much of Heppner in ruins. Raging into town, the flood wall stopped and doubled back on itself behind the new 2-story Heppner steam laundry, home of its proprietors Fred and Anna Krug and their 5 children. The laundry building cantilevered over a creek that just a few hours before had been its tame, serviceable self. The laundry held back the main wall of water long enough for the wave to build the power to tear the building to pieces. Long enough for anyone unbelievably lucky to see the water stalling there and dash to higher ground, but not long enough for the Krug family to escape. The flood took them all, Fred and Anna, Mary, Emma, Fred Jr., George, and an infant. One of the guests at the palace, A.B. Bradbury, remembered the flood at that point as a bank of water 20 feet high, swirling and foaming. Other witnesses would agree with salesman N.L. Tucker's 30-foot estimate, though some thought it was 50 feet high. The wave had its way with the houses in its path. These tilted, shivered for an instant, then collapsed, and the human beings they contained were either crushed to death by the falling timbers or overwhelmed by the rushing water and strangled in the muddy torrent. Houses raised up from the dirt on timbers and cornerstones, a common construction method, were especially vulnerable. The water would sweep under the house, lift it from the stones, and hoist it like a boat to the wave's crest. There, it spun and juggled the house until it disintegrated, or tossed it ahead to the same end. Antone Abrahamsik, a tailor known for his fine gentleman's suits and for always whistling a tune, lived with his family a block northwest of the Krug's laundry. Heppner's saloon owner David McCaddy watched from the hill as the Abrahamsik house was demolished. Antone's wife Herminia was home with their 22-year-old daughter Margaret. Luckily, Antone Jr. and Yahoni were anywhere else. Antone Sr. was in his shop on May Street, probably working and whistling, minutes from being swamped himself. After killing Herminia and Margaret, the wave eliminated all evidence that William and Eliza Barrett and their children had ever lived just across the creek. Through South Heppner, the ground east of Willow Creek rose more and more steeply, which meant that minutes after it entered Heppner, the water could not spread east. Instead, it was shoved west into an even more ferocious attack on the homes that lined up south to north on Court Street and Kirk Street, and a few moments later, Chase Street. Cora Mae Ashbaugh was surrounded by all 7 children she and Ed had brought into this world. They had moved to this handsome home at Court and Canyon a year earlier when Ed took up his duties as county commissioner. Ed was in Portland. The flood took every loved one under his roof. Cora, their daughters Iva, Irma, Mary, Cecil Fay, Gladys, and 5-week-old Mildred, and their son Gilbert. About the same time, the wave struck Tom and Rebecca Howard and their daughters Mary, Nellie, and Mabel. It could have been worse. Lizzie, Wayne, and Ida Howard were at the Ray Creek Ranch. Tom nearly survived. The flood carried him almost 2 miles, and he was about to climb out at Hiram Clark's ranch. Clark was reaching to help him when a telegraph pole struck Tom in the head. Immediately north of the Ashbaughs, the wave picked up the McBride home and drove it away. The victims were Sam McBride, farmer and wagon maker, Hannah, his wife of 25 years, their daughters, Anna and 15-year-old Alma, and their sons, Ralph, 13, and Wilford, 7. Walter was in the mountains tending Ed Day's sheep. Thankfully, Fred and Harold also were away. At 5:30 p.m., photographer Bert Sigsbee took a picture of shallow water spreading across the streets of South Heppner. This eerie photograph was later presumed to capture the beginning of the Heppner Flood. What Bert's camera could not see in the distance off to the right was that, by that moment, the Heppner Flood had already killed 52 men, women, and children. Bert captured the image from his second-floor studio at May and Main just before he and Sadie McCarty ran to the West Hill. The flood crest was about 2 minutes from appearing in the range of his viewfinder. Within 3 minutes, the water on May Street was 5 or 6 feet deep. 2 minutes after that, it looked to some like 20. Normally, Willow Creek wound peacefully through the backyards of the Ayers family south of May Street on Chase. Not this day. The flood began its assault with Ava Thornton, daughter of Tom Ayers' wife, Eliza. Ava's husband, George, was Morrow County roadmaster, famous for working hard but always spending Sundays with Ava and their 3 children. The flood claimed George, 40, Ava, 35, and 6-year-old Doris. The 2 Thornton sons were safely at another home where they had been sent to get flowers for the evening program at church. Rushing on from the Thornton house, the torrent only swiped the porch of the home John Luther Ayers shared with his wife, Mary Ellen. Johnny Ayers, son of William and nephew of Tom Ayers, was about 2 blocks north on Chase Street, visiting George and Lily Conser. Just north of John's house, the water lifted the home of his brother, Alfred, and spun it away, fortunately right into a row of cottonwood trees that stopped the structure and held it there. But Alfred Ayers' son William had no such luck. When Bill and Anna's house was wrenched to pieces, 3 of their children were swept away. Bill pulled himself onto one of the uprooted trees and rode it more than a mile, while Anna, thrown into a cherry tree at the edge of the main current, held on until the water dropped. Charles, the only child to survive, was carried on debris down to the train depot and washed against a boxcar. He managed to climb in, but the flood killed Bessie, 10, Winnie, almost 7, and Lyndon, 5. When the wave crashed into Tom Ayers' house, it found 6 people climbing to the roof over the kitchen. Tom, Eliza, William, Tom's daughter Mary Kirk, and her 2 children, Francis and Earl. As the house was swept west toward Maine, they hung on while the first story was torn off piece by piece and the second story shoved north across the street. Their journey ended suddenly as the second story and roof lodged against parts of buildings piling up on the Main Street side of the Palace Hotel. It was hard to hear over the roar. One man said that from a few miles away, the flood sounded like Niagara Falls from the same distance. Gertrude Crawford never wanted to go to the Pacific Ocean because waves on the beach reminded her of the sound of the Heppner Flood. Add to that the chorus of huge boulders slamming into iron farm machinery, doors and porches being ripped into firewood, crockery shattering into bits. Still, those who made it to the hills heard voices, crying out in fear, calling to loved ones, screaming. Survivors closed inside their homes said they hadn't heard any of it. The growling thunder and the pounding rain and hail obscured the rush of the flood and the cacophony of its violence. Most families didn't know that a flood was minutes or seconds away. Some survivors said even when they went to the window to look, they couldn't see through the rain. The flood made splinters of the little houses of Heppner's Chinese residents and killed their occupants. It pulverized one cluster of houses on the east bank of Willow Creek between the Ayers homes and the Morrow County Courthouse. The other Chinese men in Heppner, at the north end of the town near the Water Street Bridge, probably lived another 10 to 15 minutes. They operated wash houses and worked in Heppner's Chinese restaurants. 4 names are known: Mak Fu, Ung Ching Hing, Hua Eng, and Suen Lui. The other victims are and were known only by the monikers they were given in the U.S. Chinese Sullivan, a wood sawyer, Chinese Charlie, and Chinese Len. At the southwest corner of Chase and May, Judge Alba Bartholomew's Star Rooming House offered rooms for 25 cents a night until the water pried up the building and swept it across May Street and west for nearly a block, crashing it into debris and Tom Ayers' house at the rear corner of the palace. The Star Building, salesman Tucker reported, formed a breakwater against which drift and debris piled until a strong barrier was formed. Striking against this, the waters divided and passed to either side, never harming those within the hotel. The highest point of the flood barely wet the feet of those who were on the lower floor, while on every side death and destruction was dealt to those less fortunate. About 200 people were saved within the brick walls of the palace. The water raged around the hotel and the breakwater protecting it, and into Main Street. Here, and only here, the floodwaters met their match. The solid row of brick and stone buildings on the west side of the street, and the Roberts Building and Oddfellows Lodge, both masonry structures, in the next block north. The stretch of stone and brick repelled the wave's west edge. One block east, the flood was demolishing the most substantial houses in Heppner and killing the people inside. It swamped the spacious home of Leonora Estes Ray and banker Columbus A. Ray. Loom was in Portland, but Leonora and her 7-year-old Lois Estes had visitors. Loom's daughter Ada Curtis and Ada's 3-year-old Lori Marie. Nora Adkins, 19, niece of Loom's late wife, had also ducked in here, seeking shelter from the storm. Both Leonora Ray and Ada Curtis were expecting any day. 2 doors north, George and Lily Consor were entertaining John Ayers and Buell McSwords. When the water began running through the street, John insisted on rushing home, resisting Lily's urging that the men race upstairs. John, 42, Buell, 38, and George Kawahara, the Consor's 22-year-old servant, ran out the front door as the Consors rushed upstairs. John, Buell, and George Kawahara were not seen alive again. The merciless floodwaters rampaged on through town, killing every person and devouring everything in the way. Near the north end of Main Street, the Heppner Hotel became the scene of a singular tragedy. When the rotating wall of water reached Main and Baltimore, it lifted the telephone livery stable roof 120 feet wide and 275 feet long and carried it off its moorings. Seconds later, the furious water tore through the hotel's walls and porches and roofing and scattered across the landscape sections of flooring, framing, stairs, and the nearly upright shell of one second-floor room, stripped of wallpaper, furnishings, and guests. The stable roof sank to the scoured ground and across other debris. When the water receded, some of the scattered steamer trunks left amid the hotel wreckage still contained the belongings of people who wouldn't be coming back. The destruction was so complete that all 25 guests inside the hotel were presumed dead, whether or not their bodies were identified. The others who died there were L. Pearl and Mae Jones, the proprietors on duty, and 3 of their children. 2 blocks northwest, Bert Phelps had finished investigating. When he saw the floodwaters demolish the bridge just across Water Street, he ran back to the house at Water and Gale. Cora wrote, "Just the minute Bert got in the door, the rush of water came, and all these houses came crashing by. If he had not gotten in just the minute he did, I feel that he would have been swept away." Bert took 6-week-old Genevieve. Cora picked up Margaret, 2.5, and they ran upstairs. Cora remembered, "He had so much hope. I never had the least ray of hope. I thought the world was coming to an end. I just held the baby in my arms and kneeled on the floor and just prayed and prayed." Assuring Cora that they would all get on the roof if the water rose upstairs, Bert crawled out there himself. He soon hollered to Cora that the debris piling up around their house and their big poplar trees would save them. When the water fell back, they found the porch had been torn off and the first floor filled with about 2 feet of mud and water, about which Cora wrote, "I will never forget how cold it was." Wallace Lipset, whose wife and daughter and home had just been taken a block south on Gale, was shoved beyond the Phelps house and then the Robert Hind home a block further north. Some distance downstream, Wallace was washed up on solid ground. He got to his feet. Robert and Zoe Hind, shocked by the wave crashing into their home, rushed up the stairs with Bert and Jean Lucille. They got as far as the second-story landing when the house split asunder and Mr. Hind was left alone, floating on the landing while his family were swept away from him. Robert was riding that landing minutes later when it sped toward the bank where Wallace Lipset had escaped. Wallace reached out to grab Robert, stepping on the piece of floating stair as he did so. In an instant, the landing slipped over, throwing Mr. Hind to safety on the bank and hurling the rescuer down into the muddy current to his death. Wallace and Robert had worked together at the Morrow County Land and Trust Company warehouses nearby, and within the previous few minutes, each had lost his wife and children, Ada Lipset and their 14th-month-old Florinda, Izoria Hind, their 18-month-old Bert, and 3-year-old Jean Lucille, whom Robert had brought home from her walk uptown with Sadie McCarty. Zoe was pregnant with the Hinds' third child. Survivors told of feeling helpless to rescue their loved ones and neighbors. The Oregonian described the enemy. It is evident that a man might as well have tried to swim in the whirlpool of Niagara. Not only did the circling eddies defy all laws of gravitation by carrying on their current great masses of stone and iron, when a mass of water is dropped unconfined upon the surface of the earth, the currents and eddies so generated more resemble the marvelous forces of a cyclone than the simple current of a river, no matter how intensified. While that dangerous water was killing people in South Heppner, at least one person realized the trajectory of the flood and, ignoring the risk, mounted a horse to warn people at the north end of town. This rider, maybe more than one, headed directly into the path of a merciless flash flood. From the time the flood struck the Abraham 6 house near the south end of town, the people living near the Heppner Hotel at Main and Church had somewhere between 4 and 8 minutes to get to high ground. No record reveals the name of this hero, nor whether he survived, but this is certain: he gave people minutes, and thus their lives. As the horsemen rode near the Heppner Hotel, Moses and Mary Ashbaugh were inside their cottage, the hail and rain pounding on their roof, the thunder roaring in incessant waves. Suddenly, Moses and Mary heard a different sound from just outside their door. A man was yelling, "Flood! Run to the hills! Flood! Run to the hills!" Mary was holding 6-week-old Kenneth. Moses swept up Floyd and dashed toward the door, urging her to come with them. Holding her baby closer, Mary started running toward her husband and son. Then she remembered. Her nephew was asleep in the bedroom. Mary was keeping 14-month-old Everett while Pearl and Mae Jones worked that day in the hotel. Mary turned and ran to Everett, strapped for safety in a buggy. Getting him loose without the benefit of decent eyesight took even her sensitive fingers too long. Mary could have followed Moses if she'd been close behind him. But by the time she freed Everett, so much time had passed, Mary knew that once she got out the door, her near blindness would keep her from escaping or saving the babies. She scooped one child into each arm and sat down on the bed.
Come away, death, and in sad silence let me be laid. Fly away, breath. I am slain by a fair, cruel maid.
June 14th, 6 p.m. Mary Ashbaugh had little time for fear or hope or prayer as she cradled 2 children and waited in her bedroom for whatever was coming. Within minutes, this 20-foot wall of water hit their little cottage and tore it all to pieces, her daughter wrote years later. And something hit my mother in the head and stunned her so that she lost both of the babies from her arms. Mary struggled against the torrent. Then something brushed her hand. She grabbed it and pulled. It was her brother's baby. She hugged Everett to her, and almost immediately they were shoved into the steps of the Methodist Episcopal Church, a little over a block from where her ordeal started. She lifted Everett from the water and pulled herself up on the steps. The water was thick with hail. The toddler was surely chilled, so Mary began peeling off his wet clothes. That's when she noticed something hanging near her chin. It was her ear, holding on by a thin piece of skin. Back at the east end of the same block, Marcus Gunn had suddenly seen a house being shoved toward the family home at Main and Church. He yelled to his children, Mary and Marcus, to run. As they raced outside, he stopped to pick up the visiting toddler, Lilia's car, and started for the door, his wife Libby just behind him. Outside, something stopped Libby, and when Marcus turned back to help, he and Lilius and Libby were struck. 11-year-old Marcus and 14-year-old Mary escaped. About the same time, James Kernan, OR&N railroad agent at the north edge of town, sat down at the depot telegraph and tapped out a warning to Ione. Flood is coming. Then he and his wife Mary ran out the depot door, aiming to reach the hill where their 3 teenagers had been led by the assistant agent, Fred Hart. They were too late. The crest raging beneath Fred's vantage point was so immense that he would remember, upon its top, big residences danced, some upside down, others on their side, and all revolving as they went. The depot was surrounded by debris, and at least one body was dragged underneath the floor, but the station stood. If they had stayed inside, James and Mary Kernan would have survived. The flood's fury near the station also took James and Mina Long and 3 of their children. The family had been living in Heppner for barely 5 months after spending most of the children's lives near Freeze-Out Ridge in the Blue Mountains, where James supported the family by cutting wood. The people lost here were James H. Long, 40, Mina Long, 30, Ray, 13, Annie, 6, and Clara, 4. 11-year-old Minnie had escaped with her sister Addie, 9, and their brother Charles, who would be 7 in August. Further north, J. Frank Oxley, Oscar Miner's stock manager, lived on the Miner Ranch with his wife and their 10-month-old son. Frank had muscled his way through the storm to the barn to get milk. Then he saw the flood pouring toward them, juggling houses as it came. He ran back to the house. Just as he reached the door, Frank was consumed by the waves sweeping up the house. Upstairs, Margaret held the baby in a rafter as the house was jostled, slammed, and spun around. When it hit a big log, the house fell apart and her son was torn away. Margaret grabbed a large chunk of debris and clung to it for 4 miles. Her raft stopped on a high spot and rescuers pulled her to safety. While the flood was taking lives in the north end of Heppner, the water at the south end, where the death started, abruptly fell back, and there the killing stopped. Witnesses would say it took about 50 minutes for the whole flood to pass a given point in Heppner, but that after about 20 minutes the water dropped enough for people to wade. So in the south end, men headed into the water with ropes or poles and on horseback, driven to again control the fate of their families and their town. The trouble was that those still alive could now see all that they and Heppner had lost. Photographer Mike Galloway waded out from his perch on Main, wearing the new suit Antone Abrahamsick had made for him, and noted, "My progress was very slow through the hay, barbed wire, boards, and hail 4 feet thick that would not support my weight." Mike made his way south. On May Street, he and others heard groaning and found Antone in his shop with a crushed pelvis. They carried him to an adjoining rooming house, but he was later moved to the palace and died there during the night. Maybe 15 minutes after Mary Ashbaugh and her nephew found refuge on the steps of the church, the water began falling away from them. A man rode up to the church. He pulled Mary and Everett up to his saddle and, urging his horse through the water and up the slope, carried them to a house on the hillside. That's where a doctor sewed Mary's ear back in place with just an ordinary needle and thread. Heppner physician A.K. Higgs was certain his wife and child had died. From his office upstairs in the new Oddfellows building, he had seen the flood racing toward the house they rented from J.W. Morrow. He ran down but watched helplessly as the house was carried away. As the water retreated, the doctor learned his loved ones were safely in church. He also grasped the fate of the consumption patient who had been camping on the Higgs lawn. Thomas B. Harriman, 52, of Long Creek in Grant County, had been living on the bank of Willow Creek for the fresh air. He preferred treatment for what would eventually be called tuberculosis. Harriman was with his son, J. Frank Harriman, 26, Frank's wife, Myrtle, 22, and his nurse, Maud Elliott of Walla Walla, who probably was Myrtle's sister. All four were lost. As the water fell in the north end, Oliver A. Devon and his brother-in-law, Mac Smith, waited near where Hinton Creek joined Willow. They came upon a drift 15 or 18 feet high where Ed Rood was stranded. He kept crying, "Save my wife! Save my wife!" We could hear her holler from somewhere inside the drift, but we couldn't locate her. It would take crews 3 days to pull apart the drift and find the body of Letitia Rood. Much of Heppner's business district had survived, and although the big warehouses at the depot collected a lot of debris, they still stood with their valuable contents, including much of the wool from the just completed clip of hundreds of thousands of sheep. Leaving Heppner, the flood spread over the wider floor of Willow Creek Valley. That was one reason the water changed character. The slow movement of the flood after passing Heppner is a matter of general astonishment, the Portland Oregonian reported. At this point, inside Heppner, the hungry torrent raced through the town in swirling eddies that tore and sucked at everything within reach, but the deluge gathered no speed as it progressed down the valley. The immense quantities of mud, timber, and wreckage which it accumulated seemed to increase its density and retard its progress. The wave rolled on like molasses, and the damaged houses it carried appeared to roll slowly down the incline of the wall of water as it turned over and reappear later in the rear. The whole thing looked like an immense revolving barrel. The race of the floodwaters was good news for Lexington, 9 miles downstream, and Ione, 8 miles farther. Bruce Kelly and Leslie Matlock probably had no idea the flood had slowed. The 30-year-old friends were drinking in the Palace Hotel bar and believed that the flood was the end of Heppner and all its inhabitants. Bruce said something like, "If we get our horses and start right away, maybe we can save the people at Lexington and the valley below." Les recalled telling Bruce to get horses at the Red Front livery stable, if there still was a livery stable, and he would run to Gillum and Bisbee for wire cutters to cut through all the farmers' fences that would cross their path. Les had to break into the store, and since the flood had cut the electricity, search for wire cutters in the dark. Wood-handled pruning shears would do. Bruce grabbed and saddled the first horses he found, and the two men met and took off atop the west hills. The frequent flashes of lightning helped them see, a trade-off balanced against the danger that the lightning would strike them or electrify the wire fences Les was cutting. Les told local historian O.M. Yeager, "Our horses were badly scared, but not much more than we were." As they passed farms and ranches, the men hollered their warning and saw lamps go out in windows as families took their meaning and headed for the hills. The flood beat them to Lexington, reaching the town at 7 p.m. Locals had seen and heard the wave coming and had been warned by telephone. The men thought Ione was still in danger, so they stopped at a farm north of Lexington so Les could get a replacement horse and took off again. In Ione, they split up to sound the alarm, then joined the citizens up on the hill where a bonfire was burning and women were cooking supper. USGS engineer Whistler would report the first water reached Ione at 10 p.m. and the crest about half an hour later. Les and Bruce spent the night with people they either saved or intended to. A slower flash flood does not mean it is a less powerful one. N.A. Leach, a longtime Lexington merchant, had visited relatives on the west side of Willow Creek near the railroad tracks. Going outside for fresh air after supper, he said, I heard a terrible roaring sound coming from the direction of Heppner. He ran up the track and saw a wall of water pouring over the railroad tracks. I rushed back to the house and succeeded in getting my family and friends out and on the high railroad grade that passes through that part of town. By this time, the water had begun to back up behind the railroad bridge. It was only a few minutes until the weight of the water snapped every piling in the bridge and on came the rushing water. About 1 a.m., when we would cross back over the creek, Leach remembered the barbed wire telephone line to the J.W. Beckett farm at 8 Mile from Nichols and Leach, the general store he owned with his brother-in-law, R.A. Nichols. I took our telephone and some dry batteries, hooked it up to the wire fence, and talked to Mr. Beckett. There was a similar telephone line from the Beckett farm to Heppner. Beckett reported someone in Heppner just told him 500 had died there. The heart of Heppner was now a flat and winding stretch of scoured mud, interrupted by enormous trails of debris and piles of broken buildings. It was not the pretty, green, and ostentatiously tasteful town it had been hours before. Now Heppner reeked. The 1 mile path through the center of town was covered in brown slime. Heppner's tough citizens were stunned. Through the evening, people searched across the alien landscape, searched and hoped they would not find the bodies they were desperate to locate. If they found a corpse, it would only destroy hope of a miracle. In the darkness, men carried torches, candles, lanterns, to peer under, around, behind. Bodies, beaten bodies, dressed primarily in mud, were everywhere. Small bands of men collected bodies that lay in plain sight. 60 children were safe inside the Methodist Episcopal Church south on Chase Street. Sunday school superintendent Alba Bartholomew and his son Fred wouldn't allow them out in the storm when their Children's Day rehearsal ended. Fred wrote later that they calculated if all the children had been allowed to go home when they finished, 23 would have perished. Moses Ashbaugh had been like a madman looking for Mary and their baby Kenneth. He finally found Mary in that house on the hill with her ear sewn back on, and with only her nephew, Everett Jones. Dan Stalter, a miner, framer, and stockman, had one reason to be thankful: his 9-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. He and Lizzie were alive, but Dan had lost his wife, Samantha, and 6 other children. Their house on Gale Street, 2 doors north of the Methodist Episcopal Church, had been slammed about 1 second after Dan heard a roar that didn't sound like thunder and saw the oncoming wave as he looked out the kitchen window. He may have yelled "upstairs" to his family, but they would not have heard or had time to act. Samantha's sister, Amy Day, wrote, "Mr. Stalter got on some driftwood, and he was holding his wife, and he was just about to get her on the drift when something washed down against them, and they both went under. When he came up again, little Lizzie was hanging to him. She said, 'I saw Papa's head and made a grab for it.' They got on a drift, and finally he saw a big box and caught it. They floated in it until it lodged. Lizzie had not a stitch of clothes on but her shoes." Gertrude Crawford wrote later to a McBride relative, "After the flood had passed, the first thing I did was to run downtown and ask everyone if they knew anything of Mr. McBride's family. No one could tell me anything except that their house was gone. A great many had fled to the hills on their side of town. It was 1 o'clock before any word could be gotten from the other side. As soon as possible, a friend came and told me that not only Anna but the whole family at home were among the lost." Tom Ayers was missing several houses and buildings along Willow Creek, including the house Mary Elizabeth had just filled with her belongings. The first floor of his own elegant home was in shreds. His damages would amount to $20,000, about $470,000 in 2007. But Tom Ayers brought a hard-won perspective to these losses. He had achieved his considerable financial success while confronting more sorrow than most men, even in those times, had been required to face. Between 1878 and 1888, he buried 2 wives and 5 children. So when people expressed sympathy for the financial blow he suffered from the flood, he told the Oregonian, "When I found the members of my immediate family safe, I was so rejoiced that money never entered my head." Late Sunday evening, someone suggested that word of the disaster should be carried to Arlington, 55 miles northwest, to be transmitted to the rest of the world. David McCaddy, who saw the state of the disaster, said he would volunteer if someone would go with him. It was after 10 p.m., but Frank Spaulding agreed to go along. They saddled up and rode through the night. Since Mayor Gillum was away, George Conser, cashier of the First National Bank, was pressed to head the emergency effort. His bank became an impromptu command center and a morgue. Men delivered bodies in rows to the polished floor of the institution. With so many homes demolished or trashed, the Heppner Hotel gone, and at least 2 rooming houses out of commission, people needed shelter. Those who still had homes opened their doors. People slept or stared at ceilings side by side until there was no place to step between them. The hallways of the stately new Morrow County Courthouse and the floors of Heppner School, both on the East Hill, were havens of security. The Gillums' home on North Jones Street welcomed all who squeezed in. The 2-story house had 9 large rooms and stood a few feet above its neighbors. Ona, at 19, the oldest Gillum daughter, knew her parents would want them to help. Gertrude Crawford remembered the floors of her family's 4-room hillside home being covered with refugees, and all night men were coming and going. I spent most of the night on the front steps listening to the reports of the men. About sunrise, Gertrude worked her way downtown and arranged for a messenger to ride 30 miles to the nearest telegraph office to notify the postal department that Postmaster Benjamin Vaughn had died. She received a telegram from Spokane acknowledging her wire and promising, "An inspector will reach Heppner as soon as possible." Until a new postmaster was appointed, 23-year-old Gertrude was in charge. Asking for help did not come naturally to this wounded community. Independence and self-sufficiency were deeply ingrained, and the native optimism presumed that the main cause of success was a person's own hard work. These people did not seem to object when the Gazette declared again and again that Heppner was at least as good as any much larger city at, well, everything. But by nightfall, George Conser and Bert Phelps must have realized that this was more than even overachieving Heppner, Oregon could handle alone. Nobody doubted that every man in Morrow County would pitch in, that every team of horses and mules would be put to the task, that all women would cook and take care of bodies and mind the farms and ranches while their husbands and sons worked for the community. Nobody doubted any of that, but everybody giving everything they had would not get the work done in time. Even though dozens of bodies had been found out in the open, many others must have been caught inside those enormous tangles of debris. The longest drift they would see in the coming days extended across the valley floor north of Heppner for half a mile. Many others were nearly that large. Bodies might be dumped in a swath a mile or more wide and as far as Ione, 16 miles north. The bodies needed to be buried. There was no helping the beloved dead ones now except to give them the dignity of a prompt and proper burial. But getting those drifts torn apart required a lot more muscle than Heppner had left. And it wasn't just a matter of the bodies. There was the putrid slime spread by floodwaters that had washed through hundreds of outhouse vaults, cellars, and barnyards. Heppner was going to need help.